welcome all of you to this public lecture series on pathways and paradigms of India's G20 presidency. I'm your host Samina Hamid. Today we will take a closer look at India, Japan and G20. And to tell us about this, I'm joined by Professor Shravani Roy Chaudhary, who has spent a career in studying India-Japan relationship in the ever-changing dynamics of Indo-Pacific. Dr. Shravani Roy Chaudhary is a professor in Japanese Studies Center in East Asian Studies, School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. She is a Japan Foundation Fellow and has been a visiting scholar to a wide number of prestigious think tanks and universities in Japan, like Nagoya University, Kobe University, among others. She's a prolific writer, and among her recent publications, to her credit, is Indo-Pacific Theater, Strategic Visions and Frameworks, Japan and its partner in the Indo-Pacific Engagements and Enlightenments. Professor Chaudhary, we are pleased to have you here. Please join me in welcoming Professor Chaudhary. Japan has been a key partner in India's economic transformation, going well beyond trade and commerce to building resilience in disaster management and building critical infrastructure. Both the nations look towards each other with a broader regional and global vision. This dynamics could vibrantly play out in G20. And I will ask Professor Shravani Roy Chaudhary to tell us how.
Thank you, Samina, and thank you, the team that is organizing this. You're doing an exemplary job. Personally, I'm very happy to have this invitation because this is my first invitation offline in JNU since 2018. So it's a long time that I have sat in a crowded arena talking. And I think to the world also, it's a time when we have learned from the pandemic, both personally as well as professionally, as well as the world in itself having gone through a disruptive thing. We've learned that we need to take care of health. We learned that we have to be resilient with as far as how to handle education, how to handle economic supply chain. So today what I'm going to try to unravel out here is to look at Japan and India as they meet up as leaders of G7 and G20, and also look at how the G20 is all about, because it is basically an ideal place where conjunctions between the North and the South happens, because G7 is up nations. So it's in G20 that the South and the North, and how is India and Japan working towards creating a bridge between the two is what I would concentrate on. I would first look into what is Japan's commitment and how is it contributing to the G7 and G20. In the past, that is G7 or G8 environment has cropped up for Japan, the leadership that they have shown with conjunction of Indian G20 leadership, and end by drawing out some commonalities. In spite of all the disruptions that we faced and having come across newer areas in which the world has to put its mind together, leaders have to work out a solution in respect to, during the pandemic we saw the supply chain concerns, and therefore the alternative resilient supply chain, or what you would today has been called as de-risking and creating supply chains. These are one thing that one has talked about. But ultimately, I think the compass will anyway go back to what the agenda that has been set as 2030, that is where we are looking at development cooperation, in which instrumental rules, regulations, etc., and governance that would create global common goods. In this, what I flagged for you are the two major areas of concerns, that is plan for action for people, planet and prosperity. It's very big whole terms which actually translate to actually taking care of finding a roadmap in which equitable and equal distribution of wealth happens in a place where planet is able to sustain itself, and therefore the SDG goals, and therefore the environmental and climate change, which in spite of having during the pandemic moving away from those goals, if we are now again coming back and re-questioning or reorienting the world towards this goal of climate and environment, and ultimately prosperity, in which each the lowest common, the most vulnerable people can get some amount of prosperity. And how do we want to do this is what the world is actually grappling. You have therefore all kinds of multifaceted bilateral, multilateral engagements which each country is engaging in to try to create a roadmap for each nations for a sustainable, prosperous lifetime, in which would enable the world to get that equitable distribution of wealth, which is what the agenda of the United Nations was at one point of time. Strengthening the universal peace in a larger freedom is yet another component which has created a large number of options in the current Indo-Pacific theater, and we would be trying to figure out how it would become an agenda. How has Japan been a committed contributor to G7 and G20? I have put in 4 words which are important: reliable, resilient, first ranked, and global player. When G7 was constructed in 1975, Japan was in the hem of affairs. Economic miracle, second largest economy, having shown to the world that an Asian country, Asian nation can rise from the debacle that had happened during the Second World War. But today, Japan's internal health is in question. Japan internally has a demographic deficit. It has a huge debt. Its budgetary debt is questionable to many countries. In fact, many countries would be in trouble with the kind of debt it has. Its economic strength is deteriorating. It is 3rd largest, soon to become the 4th largest. Its social fabric is questionable because of the demographic deficit in one hand, the other is how to reorient the demographic deficit. Politically, it has not been a very stable country for a large number of years, yet it does not encounter any kind of destructive behavior among its people. And that actually is the strength and probably makes it a reliable nation, because it sticks to the rules settings that it creates for itself, whether it is with respect to a 0 interest rate, which was unknown at the time when Japan came up with it, and yet it has been picked up by other countries at various points of time. So, the reliability of long term policies is something that Japan has. Reliability in focusing in areas that it thinks is important. Right from Kyoto Protocol, it has consistently kept its compass focused on environmental concerns, decarbonizing, and that is what creates its reliability. Resilient, in spite of having so much of domestic issues, it has pursued its developmental aid agenda throughout these years, constructively working in trying to create economic development model across the Southeast Asian nations at one point of time, now trying to move into South Asia and to the Africa. It has been a first ranked among the Asian nations. It has gained a certain amount of imaging and visibility among the developed nations. It has certain standing for being, being a country that remains geared and committed to whatever it agrees to do. It is definitely a global player today. In the past this century, certain changes domestically, especially with the leadership of Abe, Japan has become also a norm setter. Norm setter in terms of infrastructure connectivity essentially. First norm setter we saw in Japan was the infrastructure promotion of quality in G7, and followed it up later on. You see the norm setter in trying to create this whole concept of free and open Indo-Pacific, the Quad, etc. So, the norm setting that Japan has done in the recent years has actually made it much more of a country that has moved significantly away from a alliance system in which it had totally submerged and stayed under the radar to ensure only that it grew economically and contributed economically, to being where it is now especially under the Indo-Pacific theater. It has its own vision called the free and open Indo-Pacific, and it has been promoted across various nations and trying to get more nations to include it, such that they could come back with Quad, which got derailed, and come back with Quad 2. It has also remained committed through various actions like in environment concerns and climate change, blue economy. It has at domestic level come up with policies that have geared the nations towards that. Internationally, it has worked very strongly in various forums to create global governance concern. Whatever has been often inked in the G7 or in G20 or in any other platform, Japan has taken it back and tried to implement it within its nation. And that is why its commitment through various actions are quite visible today. Kishida came into power in December 2021. He had a whole list of things that he had to do in the domestic level. It was considered that Abe came up with what was called Abenomics. It did not work. So everyone was concerned during the election that what is the plan that he is going to come up. Will he come up with his Kishida's doctrine, or what would it be? But the entire focus moved when the Ukraine crisis happened in February 2022. What was so significantly difficult for Japan to accept was that you see out here, Ukraine today may be East Asia tomorrow, and that geared Japan's entire agenda, Kishida's entire agenda, to focus on telling the world that we have to be concerned about Ukraine crisis because it can have repercussions elsewhere. Kishida also, and along with it, the narrative in Japan was very clear that many global South countries did not join, and for Kishida that was not a very good view. Effectively, Kishida then turns around and tries to use his leadership of G7. Him and his entire team of his cabinet secretaries, especially his foreign minister, would venture into not only meeting all the leaders of the G7, but Kishida makes a trip to India in 2022 March, where he talks significantly about Ukraine crisis, though the joint statement very clearly points out our view states that we are strategically autonomic with respect to Ukraine, and that we do agree that the war is not a right thing. However, Kishida goes around the world, his foreign minister also, to the extent of not only coming to India, ASEAN countries, or to the Western world, but to Africa, to Pacific Islands, especially Solomon and New Guinea. All this pointed out to Kishida that he has to bring global South back into the picture and gain currency within the global South. How was he going to be doing that? He realized that he has to create a kind of a vision or a strategy which will point out to the fact that Japan would consider itself one of the leaders in creating this rule-based order or maintaining the rule-based order. Therefore, domestically he goes ahead with a national security strategy which comes up, it's the second one, it's in 2022 end December 16, where he clearly puts Russia and China as an enemy of Japan. He talks about unprecedented and greatest strategic challenge is China. which he had the 2013 had toned down the China's role in the East Asia as a a much more cooperative kind of China was what Japan had intended at that point of time, but right now it declared itself as a greater strategic challenge. So also was Russia because of aggression in Ukraine. While between 2012 and 2020, the US Japan alliance was in turmoil, first because of Obama's rapprochement aspect, and then comes Trump, who sets America first. The fact that America moved away from CPTPP was a greater concern for Japan, and Japan continues to want to have America back in it. In spite of all this, the national security strategy of 2020 alliance upfront and talks about collaboration with like-minded people with enhancement, and therefore no longer is Japan only looking at the alliance system, but it is also going to be looking at like-minded countries. In the like-minded countries, we as India become their partner. There are more to come, let us see. Then, having put the strategy in place where he ensured to the world that he is definitely going to look at like-minded partners, he comes up with a new free and open Indo-Pacific in March 23, where he declares that India is an indispensable partner, and this particular document is revealed in ICWA in India in March, when he had come visiting to invite our Prime Minister for the G7. Kishida talks about Japan intending to propose a guiding perspective to the world in a verge which is verging in division and confrontation, and he comes up with 4 new pillars, nothing very new to the previous one, other than the fact that he talks about a multi-layered connectivity. We will come to that also, but otherwise he talks about obviously peace building. He also talks about efforts to securitize and safe use of sea to the air, that is everything comprehensively, which is something that is new. In the previous things you talked about security, maritime security, this time there is an addition of air also. Japan's tool in hand, because of its pacifist constitution, has always been the aid as a tool to reach out to the neighboring countries, as well as far off today to the African countries also, in which Japan has had positions of difference. At one point of time, Japan's aid was considered to be a diplomacy of resources. At one point of time, aid was considered to be basically an extortion, to aid which became, because of the criticism, Japan took currency of this exploitation, extortion and resource diplomacy to put in a factor of humanitarian cause for greater public welfare, in which therefore water, sanitation, etc. came into being. And ultimately today it uses it in a large amount of aid goes in the form of infrastructure and connectivity project. Essentially what it talks about as quality growth, not only to ensure growth, but it sort of becomes an engine for industrial development, which they are talking about today as industrial value chain. So 3 I's are infrastructure, industrial value chain and initiative to growth. So these are the 3 things that they bring into the thing called the development charter today. It talks about, this development charter gives another key thing. It talks about strengthening free and open international order. And how does Japan plan to do this? It elaborates this in the form of strengthening free and open international order through encouraging the global south to become more resilient, self-sufficient and integrated into the globalized world. But it also talks about the increasing complexity that the pandemic has thrown open with respect to health for all, education for all, and would constructively work towards including these into the infrastructure connectivity. So, what is infrastructure and infrastructure connectivity essentially meaning hereafter for Japan? It would not only mean building various infrastructures for connectivity between countries to within countries, but it will also look at building a ecosystem that would be sustainable, that would look at taking into consideration the local needs, and therefore project a much more vibrant ecosystem that connects nation to nation through its own connectivity agenda. We will come to that a little later. So, in the Hiroshima summit in May 2023, if I were to just put it in a nutshell, this is what it actually brings to the table. It brings back Japan tried hard through its various levels of engagement to bring back focus on the Indo-Pacific and other global commons and not be Ukraine oriented, though there were 2 sessions in the G7 that totally involved itself with Ukraine. Japan reached out to Global South. If you look at the invitees in G7, all of them were Global South countries, and including of course the other United Nations, etc. But there was a large number of representation like Indonesia, India, Brazil, the Troika, which is the G7, G20 group. You also had of course a visit from the Ukraine thing, which was a big news. But reaching out to the Global South, they had 2 sessions in which Global South was definitely looked into at that point of time. And it was essentially to do with connectivity, with promoting and development of initiatives that would lead towards Global South integrating into the global world. Collaboration was also looked upon beyond the traditional security with respect to technological areas of cyber, emerging disruptive technologies, AI and strategic communications. But a common endeavor for a resilient and sustainable planet was brought back into the focus, which was something that had got lost during the pandemic. Sustainable development and the agenda of 2030 being again discussed out here. But what Japan individually achieved as a nation to put into place is what is called the individually tailored partnership program. Details of it is a little more complicated, one does not know how it will work out, but what it essentially is meaning is that whenever you are partnering with another country for a for any kind of developmental program, it would not necessarily be Japan or any of these OECD countries individually doing, but partnering with people, partnering with another country to put forth something that is transparent, that follows rules of law, and that does not lead to any kind of disruption in the local thing. You very well know that Sri Lanka's current crisis is obviously turned towards the way it had got into its debt. We as India's G20 leader have this huge responsibility as world went into came back from the pandemic. The 3 key words that was used in the G20 summit was inclusive, decisive and action oriented. As we kicked off the leadership of G20, we also had the Global South Summit. I think that was India's great plan, and bringing back the South narrative into focus, and that particular summit gave India an agenda of what you see out here. It talked about an accelerated, inclusive, sustainable, resilient growth. Very loaded words. Inclusive meaning not only taking into account the nations that are being able to develop, but nations which are really in debt crisis. World statistics are showing things which are becoming more scary over time, and it is very keen in need at this point of time is how does the countries which are developed or in a possibility of having certain capabilities are going to help these countries to um, to come out of this economic crisis that they're going through or are in the verge of. So the inclusivity is this. But the whole dynamics change as soon as you put in the sustainability, because sustainable growth sometimes takes longer. Many countries do not have a roadmap on which or somewhere to borrow from, because it is sustainability was not something that was there in the 1970s or 80s. So the models are going to be different when you look at sustainability, and how do you take care of it, or how do you have an economic model that is sustainable as well as growth oriented is a question that is engaging both practitioners as well as policymakers and academics. Yet this is something that needs to be looked into very carefully while you start developing, because nations which have developed without these concerns are today nations that are examples of what can go wrong. Resilient growth has become very important, especially during the pandemic. It showed that the countries that were resilient were the ones that were able to overcome the whole crisis. It was also, the pandemic also showed the world that the South-South could become closer to each other. Within the southern countries, countries have helped each other, Indonesia being one such example. Indonesia went forward to help its neighboring countries to become more resilient with respect to food, etc. So the food security concerns, that is one of the major concern of the global South, seems to have solution within the South. So this is something that is become very critically new area of development, and that has a certain kind of implications. You have acceleration and progress in sustainable development goals. This takes you back to the Agenda 2030, which has a long list of ways that sustainable development can happen, both at the economic front, at the social front, at the political front. Green Development Pact for Sustainable Future, this is where a large number of technologies are there to be picked up, right from your electric vehicle option to decarbonization by various kinds of filtering that can be done and various levels. Technological changes with respect to how AI can help in porting water from A to B place. How need of people can be accessed better, quicker through the drone system. That is something that disaster areas can benefit from. All this comes under the Green Development Pact. Multilateral institution of 21st century, I don't have to talk, currently BRICS has come into picture. You have lots of things happening, one looks at what would be. So there are lots of options that are going to open up. Probably South-South might become much more stronger and better forum to work with. In fact, G7 countries are probably considering the whole thing of how they will reorient themselves to the needs of G20, because G20 is a much more dynamic and has more presence of both worlds, which is what I said, the North-South bridge. And digital public infrastructure is where India-Japan partnership is going to be moving in the new direction. It is in this place that ideally the partnership between India-Japan takes a different trajectory. With respect to infrastructure development, we had always felt that, finance, we are lacking in finance, Japan is giving us the finance and we are going forward with our infrastructure developments, etc. So Japan was a giver, we were the taker. But in technological transformation, there are places where we are the leaders and they have to be the takers. One such thing is digitalization, where India has been much better than Japan, because Japan did not follow a technology and they came back to the technology later. So they are in trouble with digitalization of their country. If you follow Japan, you know that they started with what is called the Aadhaar card of India, a similar thing in Japan, and they countered a huge problem because they did not, there was a mismatch between people's identity and people where it was placed itself in the digital place. So digitalization is one place where India has a lot to give to Japan. There is a lot of other areas in critical technologies, in renewable energies, in startups, where India is way ahead with Japan, and Japan therefore India and Japan can actually come into what Japan calls as offer type or partnership in the third country. And this is where the connectivity which we are talking about as Japan's major multi-layered connectivity that Japan has put into focus in the free and open Indo-Pacific is where India can be a huge partner, because when it talks about multi-layered, it basically moves beyond the physical infrastructure and connectivity to digital. And it is this place where India and Japan can work together in third country. Third countries where India and Japan have already started some engagement is being in the Bay Area, that is in Bangladesh. Bay Area, as it's come to mean, is the Bay of Bengal initiative in one end, which is basically a northeast India connecting up to the Bangladesh, and from there on they would like to connect it up to what is called the southeast South Economic Corridor, that is the Cambodia and thereof to Japan. So, that is the connectivity that they are looking at. So, they are going beyond helping countries now individually to looking at a regional, and the one sub theatre that is coming up in the Indo-Pacific is the Bay, in which it gets parenthesis from the Sri Lanka initiative to Bangladesh initiative, and the entire Bay Area will therefore become a very, it's expected by their vision that it should become a very vibrant ecosystem where economic, the industrial value chain that would originate they assume it to originate from Nepal to Bhutan through the northeast India to Bangladesh, and Bangladesh has a port that they are developing called the Matabari port, which is a deep port, and that is very important because the entire Bay Area is has the problem of silting, and silting does not allow ships of certain depth to come in. So, the deep sea port that they are originating, in which 300 trillion tons of cargo can be transported through that Bay Area, is where they would be looking at using that through this network, and therefore, our Act East policy to their Bay initiative merges together to form what they call as the Bay initiative. And this Bay is very easily linked to the Indo-Pacific, because you have the Malacca Strait on which it falls. So, if you can keep that area free and open, or then the resources moving through that Malacca Strait up to Japan becomes a free and open area, which is in contention by both China and USA. So, that's where we as a partner could be very useful on the strategic front. Gender equality, empowering all women and girls, is part of obviously the agenda that India has set for itself. This is the place where Japan does not qualify very well. It is way down as far as gender equality goes. Even today they are grappling with socially with this aspect of whether demography is related to the equality question, or is forced equality preventing demographic challenges. So, this is a challenge for Japan sociologically, and so for them to participate in gender equality and empowering of women and girls across the world has become an agenda within the developmental aid developmental charter that they have come up in 2023 this year. And it looks to be a place where again they would have a lot to learn from us in this place. So, what are the commonalities that we can draw from the engagement that India, Japan are doing in their respective leadership? Both of them have put the concerns of Global South up front. They have put the concerns of sustainable development back into discussion, and as a part both in the summit of G20 that we are going to have and the G7, they have had substantial 2 or 3 sessions and large number of working committees which have looked into various verticals of this sustainable development. Renewable energy, energy security, food security, all comes as a part of sustainable development. Focus on connectivity structure as a road for uplifting the Global South, and this is where Actually, what Japan plans is hereafter that each infrastructure development would also be looked upon as an industrial value chain. So every country which looks at gets aid for infrastructure development, they would also be educated to use that infrastructure connectivity for industrial purpose. So an industrial hub around a port, industrial hub around the road, industrial hub around a railway system is what they are planning to put into action, and much of it is even there in our country. When you see the DMIC corridor, you see the Bangalore Mumbai corridor, all of them have that, but it had not been put into focus, and that is something that Japan has not been able to. It has not gone to the world with the story, it's done it in silence. I think the story is now to go to the world and tell them that this is what we do. Digitalization as an option for development and securitization of nations, I have just given you examples, and obviously building world through multilateralism is what both the countries aspire to. India's aspiration of becoming a power player within this global system by being adhering to the global rules and helping global commons are also something that Japan executes itself. But however, Japan realizes very well it has its own limitation as a small nation, demographically challenged nation, that it cannot do anything in isolation or single-handedly, and therefore this indispensable partnership that it has decided for itself and chosen India to be one is essentially to kick off a partnership that would now look towards becoming much more stronger, much more effective in the engagements beyond the bilaterals. So, it will go beyond the bilaterals to engage multilaterally or take the strength of both these partners into third country in either creating operational or good governance system. I think with this I'll stop out here. Thank you, Sunil.
Thank you, Professor Shabani Chaudhary. Japan has always evoked a lot of interest and confidence, and your lecture has put all of this in a much deeper and clearer context. And I'm sure students are eagerly waiting to know more on some aspects of your lecture, so we'll invite some questions from the floor. So whosoever wishes to ask questions, please raise your hand, identify yourself, and you can go ahead. Yes.
Particularly in Indo-Pacific region. So, what do you think? What are those issues of convergence and divergence between India and Japan, as they both are the members of G20 in context of Indo-Pacific? Thank you.
If you look at narrative of Japan in the Indo-Pacific to India, I think the major thing is how do you treat China. For a long time, India believed, India pushed the thing of inclusivity of China. It's only after 2018-19 that we have generally come away from it. Therefore, convergence between Japan and India in the development in security has become much more easier right now. With developmental issues, I think for a time since the Indo-Pacific theatre grew, there was a lot of convergence between both the countries, but I think the first divergence was seen when we did not sign the RCEP. We not signing the RCEP has its own implications, but for Japan it was a pretty tough thing to digest, because again, Japan was looking at India as a partnering within the RCEP such that to contain China in its economic agenda. So therefore, when India did not sign, it was definitely tough for Japan to accept, and Japan continues and to engage with India to try to get India back into RCEP. We will not get into why India did not get in, but I will give you the Japan's version. The Japan uses each opportunity to talk to India about RCEP when it gets it. Similarly, it talks to USA at each point of time to talk about CPTPP. These are the two places where Japan economic architecture wants both these nations back in the folds.
Thank you so much for your time and sharing your expertise with us. Please join me in thanking her.
Thank you.